Right here between Germany and Poland, there's a place that was once Poland's #1 trading hub back in the day. Ships, cargo, and massive amounts of money flowed through this spot. Poland lost all of that. And now, right here next to Germany, the countries decided to dump tons of dirt. But this infuriated Germany because the problem wasn't just the dirt. The thing is, in the 16th and 17th centuries, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth existed on these lands. And it wasn't some quiet corner of Europe where people simply grew grain for themselves. Massive volumes of grain were shipped west from here. Inland, this grain was loaded onto barges and sent down the rivers to the sea. The main route was the Vistula River, and the primary outlet was Danzig, modern-day Dansk. It was a major port located right where the Vistula flows into the Baltic Sea. And this is where the real trade began. That's because grain in Western Europe was much more expensive than in Poland. For example, in the 1650s, Holland, prices could be twice as high. For foreign merchants, it was the perfect place to do business. They could arrive in Danzig, buy grain at a low price, and ship it off to markets where it sold for much more. As a result, there were a lot of ships here. At the peak of the trade, up to 500 vessels could be docked at once, which was simply an incredible number for that era. Many of the traders were Dutch, but the shipping routes stretched much further, all the way to Portugal and North Africa. And Poland truly thrived on this. In the 16th century, this trade became one of the drivers of a massive economic boom, often referred to as the Polish Golden Age. The country was called the breadbasket of Europe, precisely because the vast amount of grain flowing down the Vistula through Dansk went on to feed the markets of Western Europe. But it wasn't just about grain. Other raw materials essential for the economy of the time were also exported through Dansk: timber, ash, pitch, tar, wax, and wool. In short, the Baltic was Poland's gateway, allowing the country to turn its resources into influence, wealth, and commercial power. But as the years went by, this story took a different turn. Now it wasn't about grain anymore, it was about fuel, factories, and war. In the 1930s, Germany understood perfectly well. If a major war broke out, the country would need enormous amounts of fuel. Tanks, trucks, airplanes, ships, none of that runs on ideology alone. They needed gasoline and all sorts of lubricants. However, fuel had to be imported, which meant that in the event of war, the supply line could simply be cut off. The simplest solution was to find a way to produce fuel domestically, and Germany did exactly that. In 1940, the IG Farben Company built 12 synthetic fuel plants across the country. Together, they produced roughly 3 million gallons a day. And one of those plants happened to be right here, very close to the sea, the port, and the river. It was Hydrierwerke Politz AG, a massive industrial facility and simultaneously a crucial cog in the Nazi war machine. It was surrounded by labor camps, other factories, and military infrastructure. Over 30,000 people worked at the facility, and the scale was massive. This single plant supplied about 15% of all the synthetic fuel consumed by Germany. Basically, the place that once helped Poland export grain and get rich off trade ended up helping the German army during World War II. And the Allies understood this perfectly. That's why, starting in May 1944, they began systematically bombing the German fuel system. They didn't just want to destroy individual buildings, they wanted to strip the German forces of their mobility. It was simple. No fuel means tanks don't move, planes don't fly, trucks don't deliver supplies. The factories in our location were targeted too. They were hit by a total of 14 air raids. But the war was left in the past, and now Poland wanted to develop the port, deepen the channels, and expand the maritime infrastructure, basically making the water more accessible for large ships. And at first, it seemed like a standard engineering job. Ships, dredgers, and equipment arrived and the work began, but it very quickly became clear that things weren't that simple at all. During World War II, this entire area became a battlefield. This wasn't just a place where gunfire could be heard in the distance. The existing shipping channel between Szewnoice and Szczecin was hit by air raids, artillery fire, mines, and other military operations. A fairway is, roughly speaking, a road for ships. You can't just sail freely everywhere in a sea or a river. Some places are shallow, others have wreckage or other hazards. So a specific strip of water is kept clear for vessels, one that's deep enough and relatively safe. Now the problem was that during the war, this exact shipping lane ran right next to a very important target, the synthetic fuel plant. The Allies bombed the factory because it fueled the German war machine. but only a fraction of the bombs actually detonated. The rest plunged into the dirt and water, and then they just sat there for decades. But the bombs were only part of the danger, because when the U.S. 8th Air Force repeatedly bombed this area in 1944 and 1945, the factory didn't just sit there and silently take the hits. It was protected by anti-aircraft defenses. They fired at the planes, and this also left behind munitions. So the future port site was hiding more than river mud. Buried beneath it was a wartime legacy: bombs, shells, mines, and other munitions that had failed to explode then, but could go off now. This problem, by the way, wasn't unique to Poland. The Baltic Sea is littered with the remnants of war. After both world wars, anything that needed to be disposed of in a hurry was dumped into its waters. Unexploded grenades, bombs, missiles, and even chemical weapons. On a map, the Baltic looks like any other sea surrounded by European countries, but lying on its seabed are roughly 300,000 tons of deadly weapons. Poland simply came face to face with the problem because it had begun working extensively on its ports, shipping channels, and seabed again. But people didn't actually have to dig anything up to feel the effects of the war. Fishermen, at least, lived with them every day. Even the most experienced crews admitted that every trip out to sea came with a sense of unease, especially when they approached the rich fishing grounds near the Danish island of Bornholm. To catch cod, fishing boats drag special nets along the seabed at depths of around 200 to 230 feet. And that happens to be exactly where tens of thousands of bombs and artillery shells were dumped after World War II. On nautical charts, these areas are marked as contaminated by munitions, with warnings that anchoring and fishing are dangerous. Fishermen went there anyway. On a good day, a boat could return with 10 tons of cod and earn between 6,000 and 10,000 euros, assuming the crew made it back alive, of course. A few years ago, one fisherman hauled up an 1,100-pound bomb along with his catch. He was lucky; it didn't explode. Despite all this, Poland eventually decided that the port had to be expanded. If the country wanted to turn this route into a major commercial gateway to Europe again, the old infrastructure was no longer enough. The port needed a new approach channel, greater depth, and enough room for ships to maneuver safely. So Poland approved the construction of a new eastern approach channel. The only problem was that dredging there was potentially lethal. At any moment, the machinery could strike a piece of unexploded ordnance that was still perfectly capable of going off. So before Poland could build the port, it first had to carry out a much more difficult operation, finding and neutralizing everything the war had left behind, both underwater and underground. But why disturb the old channel at all? Why deepen it, widen it, and drag all those remnants of war back up from the seabed? The answer was fairly simple. The port was falling behind the rest of the world. The old shipping channel was too shallow and too narrow, which limited the size of the vessels that could enter the port. This wasn't about making the port look newer or more attractive. No, large modern ships simply couldn't get through anymore. That was why the modernization project was launched, to deepen and widen the channel, to turn it into a maritime highway built not for the past, but for the future, and everything else along those lines. Though modern trade wasn't transformed by some gigantic ship, it all started with the shipping container. The idea was remarkably simple. Instead of loading sacks, crates, and barrels by hand as people had done for centuries, cargo could be placed inside a standardized box. Make that box out of steel, and it became even more useful. It could be lifted off a truck, loaded onto a ship, transferred to a train, and then placed back onto another truck. One format for the entire journey. In the 1950s, standardized steel containers developed around requirements set by the U.S. Department of Defense began transforming the entire freight industry. The first commercially successful container ship was the Ideal X. On its maiden voyage, it carried just 58 steel containers. Then the race began. By the 1980s, container ships were capable of carrying between 3,000 and 4,500 containers. And that was only the beginning. For years, the Panama Canal placed a natural limit on ship size. If companies built much larger ships, they simply wouldn't fit through the canal. That would make the journey longer, slower, and more expensive. Then the Panama Canal was expanded. It could now handle larger vessels, and ships began growing again. By 2006, container ships could carry between 11,000 and 15,000 containers. By 2013, capacity had reached around 18,000. The newest giants have reached a scale at which a single ship can transport as many as 25,000 containers in one voyage. The port of Świnoujście, however, was not prepared for any of this. The world had built gigantic ships, but its old shipping channel remained far too shallow and narrow for the new reality. By the way, ships didn't keep getting bigger because someone at the U.S. Department of Defense simply liked everything big. There was a very clear economic logic behind it. The more containers a ship carries on a single voyage, the lower the transportation cost per container. Some expenses remain relatively stable, a crew still required, fuel still consumed, the ship still has to be maintained, but carrying 5,000 containers is one thing. Carrying 10,000 is something else entirely. An enormous container ship benefits from economies of scale. One large vessel requires less steel, a smaller combined crew, and less fuel than two smaller ships carrying the same total volume of cargo. That allows the shipping company to offer more capacity at a lower price per container, and that changes the entire competitive landscape. A company operating larger ships becomes more attractive to customers. It can carry more cargo at a lower cost. Companies with older or smaller vessels quickly begin to lose ground because they offer less capacity at a higher price. But more importantly, major shipping companies were becoming increasingly attractive to the ports themselves. When a port secures a contract with a major carrier, large volumes of cargo arrive along with it. That means more work for the terminals and, naturally, more revenue. As a bonus, it gives the port greater influence within global trade. That's why ports are eager to compete for these carriers by offering discounts, reducing fees, and providing special terms in exchange for guaranteed cargo volumes. Świnoujście was left with a choice. Either the port adapted to the new generation of enormous ships and remained part of global trade, or it failed to adapt and watched those ships go somewhere deeper, wider, and more convenient. You can probably guess which option it chose, but modernization meant more than simply digging the seabed a little deeper. To accommodate larger vessels, the entire waterway had to be rebuilt. Under the project, officially known as the modernization of the Świnoujście-Szczecin Fairway to a depth of 41 feet, the existing channel was widened to at least 330 feet and deepened, you'll never guess, to 41 feet. But the work didn't stop there. The seabed had to be leveled, the banks had to be rebuilt, in some places the shoreline needed reinforcement. Elsewhere, hydraulic structures had to be reconstructed or nearby infrastructure had to be relocated. The turning areas required their own design. For large vessels, navigating the channel is only part of the challenge. It also needs sufficient room to maneuver safely, otherwise one ship gets stuck and brings global trade crashing to a halt. Remember the container ship Ever Given, which blocked the Suez Canal? Exactly. That's why the turning basins also had to be widened and deepened. Meanwhile, workers reinforced the banks and quay walls along the channel and relocated cables and navigational markers. In fact, both the port and the shipping channel were being adapted to the new scale of maritime trade. Poland wanted to eliminate the old restrictions that prevented large vessels from entering the port safely. It wanted to improve navigation, increase capacity, handle more cargo, and make its ports more competitive within the Baltic region. The project cost approximately 313 million euros, or around $362 million, and was partly funded by the European Union. But there was another layer to the story. It wasn't just that ships had grown too large for the old shipping channel, there was also the border. Access to the port ran through the Bay of Pomerania along the northern approach channel. An artificially deepened sea passage roughly 37 miles long and 47 feet deep. From Poland's perspective, the channel and its anchorage lie within Polish territorial waters. Germany, however, saw things a little differently. It argued that the section of the channel located more than about 14 miles from the low water line was already inside Germany's exclusive economic zone. Poland found itself in an awkward position. The port needed to expand, accommodate larger vessels, blah, 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 you get the idea. But part of the existing route crossed an area that Warsaw and Berlin simply couldn't agree on. So this wasn't just an engineering problem, a matter of where to dredge, where to widen the channel, or where to position the equipment. It was also a political and geographical dispute. Poland could talk all at once about expanding the port, but every step can't keep getting bogged down in arguments over who controls the waters and who has the right to operate there. And that still wasn't the whole story. Poland was carrying out the project right next to the German island of Usedom, known in Germany for its beaches, seaside resorts, tourists, and tranquil shores. Then out of nowhere, a huge port development begins rising nearby. Instead of a seaside resort, a deep water terminal, new approach routes for large vessels, containers, trucks, noise, floodlights, constant ship traffic, and an industrial zone appearing beside a coastline that Germans expected to look entirely different. So Germany wasn't angry simply because Poland was supposedly encroaching on its waters. To German activists and local people, it looked as though an enemy was emerging right next to their tourist coastline. They warned about risks to the water, birds, fish, as well as noise, odors, and damage to tourism. Poland saw the situation very differently, for this was an opportunity to move the port into a new league and capture a larger share of Baltic cargo traffic. For Poland, this was more than just a port. Świnoujście was gradually becoming the country's northern gateway, not only for containers, but for energy as well. An LNG terminal was already operating there, allowing Poland to receive gas by sea from almost anywhere in the world instead of relying on the old overland supply routes. In other words, right next to Germany, Poland wasn't just building another piece of port infrastructure, it was bringing together in one place what had previously been spread across separate systems: trade, gas, shipping, terminals, new sea approaches, and access to Central Europe. That was exactly why the area became so sensitive. To a tourist standing on the German coast, it might have looked like yet another industrial monster rising on the horizon. But for Poland, it was a way to turn the northwestern part of the country into a gateway for both goods and energy. There was another important point. Poland wasn't building all of this solely for itself. The real significance of Świnoujście and Szczecin was that they didn't serve only the Polish coast. Behind them lay a huge section of Central Europe, Western Poland, the Czech Republic, Slovakia, and a network of industrial regions, warehouses, factories, and cities that all needed access to the sea. The Czech Republic and Slovakia have no coastline of their own, but cargo arriving at a Polish port can continue inland by road, rail, and inland waterways. In other words, Poland wasn't just trying to build a port near the German border, it wanted to create a maritime gateway for several countries. Germany understood perfectly well what was happening. Every container routed through Poland was one less container that had to pass through a German port. Poland wasn't simply dumping soil into a lagoon, it was trying to draw cargo away from rival ports by offering landlocked countries its own route to the sea. Nevertheless, in May 2023, Poland decided to build a new eastern approach channel. Instead of following the disputed route near Germany, the new channel would run farther northeast, through waters that were not contested. It was designed to be around 43 miles long with a navigable depth of 56 feet. And that decision shows just how important the project was to Poland. It wasn't dredging the seabed merely to create another channel, it was trying to give the port a deeper, more convenient, and legally far less contentious entrance from the sea. Throughout all this work, the port remained open, ships continued to come and go while dredging equipment operated alongside normal vessel traffic. That, by the way, was a major challenge in its own right. The work had to be organized so that dredgers, barges, and support vessels wouldn't interfere with ships entering the port. Marine surveys were conducted, safe maneuvering routes were calculated, and planners had to account for how the vessels would operate, leave the site fully loaded, and return empty. From there, everything depended on clear communication among everyone involved. Vessel traffic controllers, local harbor pilots, ship crews, and construction teams all needed to know exactly where everyone else was and where they were heading. And apparently they did. Because in the end, the port was successfully modernized. The shipping channel was deepened and widened, the seabed was surveyed, and dangerous objects were recovered and safely disposed of. Then came another interesting detail. All the material dredged from the seabed wasn't simply hauled away and forgotten. The dredged material was used to create new islands. The project called for roughly 865 acres of new land across 2 artificial islands. The material removed from the seabed was used to form their foundation. Well, why let it go to waste, right? And so 2 islands appeared beside the shipping channel, measuring roughly 0.8 and 1.1 miles across. The same ground that had only just been cleared of the remnants of an old war became part of an entirely new landscape. Of course, this wasn't just a matter of dumping sediment into the sea. The islands were designed as environmental compensation for the disruption caused by the project. Sort of, sorry we tore up the seabed over here, but hey, look, 2 brand new pieces of land. More than 9,000 trees and shrubs were planted on the islands and along the shipping channel, creating a variety of habitats for wildlife and birds. Oh, and something really funny happened there. The islands were still under construction, but the birds had already started acting like they'd found their new home. They began arriving and nesting in such large numbers that parts of the construction schedule had to be revised. Certain areas had to be fenced off so the birds wouldn't be disturbed. But even when it seemed as though the hardest work was finally over, the Baltic Sea offered a reminder of why marine infrastructure can never simply be finished once and for all. Just as Poland had made it through the old munitions, removed millions of cubic feet of sediment, built new islands, brought the project close to completion, and all that remained was to open the new shipping route to large vessels, two powerful storms struck, and they did something that sounds almost like the sea was mocking the entire effort. It began filling in what people had only just finished digging out. The storms lifted sediment from the seabed and carried it straight back into the work zone. Areas that had already been dredged to the required depth were suddenly covered by a fresh layer of deposits. In other words, Poland wasn't just dredging up an old seabed, it was working against a system that kept moving even after the project was finished. The dredging equipment had to be brought back, the dredgers returned to remove the newly deposited sediment and restore the channel to its designated depth, and that captures the key lesson of the entire project. A port can't be built once and left alone like a wall or a highway. A sea route is alive. The seabed shifts, storms reshape it, and if a country wants to keep welcoming large ships, it can't simply carve out a route to the sea, it has to keep wresting it back from the sea. So a project that began with oversized ships, an outdated shipping channel, and bombs buried on the seabed ended in a surprisingly different place. Poland didn't just rebuild the approach to the port and transform former munition sites into thriving spaces, it also learned an important lesson. This new infrastructure will have to be maintained indefinitely. That's the price of bringing in more ships and containers. You owe me a like. See you later.